OWASP, Open Web Application Security Project, is an international non-profit organization dedicated to improving software security. Here are the top 10 OWASP security risks along with a brief description. 1. Injection attacks. This occurs when an attacker injects malicious code into an application's inputs to bypass authentication and access sensitive data. This type of attack is one of the most common and dangerous web application security risks. It occurs when an attacker injects malicious code into an application's inputs to bypass authentication and access sensitive data. Examples include SQL injection attacks, which exploit vulnerabilities in SQL queries to access or modify data, and command injection attacks, which exploit vulnerabilities in command line interfaces to execute malicious code on a system. One common example of an injection attack is SQL injection, where an attacker inserts malicious SQL code into an application's input fields to access or modify sensitive data. For instance, an attacker could use SQL injection to steal user login credentials, delete or modify data in a database, or even take over an entire system. 2. Broken authentication and session management. This occurs when authentication and session management mechanisms are not implemented correctly, allowing attackers to steal user credentials, session IDs, or cookies. This occurs when authentication and session management mechanisms are not implemented correctly, allowing attackers to steal user credentials, session IDs, or cookies. Examples include session fixation attacks, which allow attackers to hijack an authenticated session, and brute force attacks, which use automated tools to guess user credentials. One example of a broken authentication and session management vulnerability is session fixation, where an attacker tricks a user into using a session ID that the attacker knows. Once the user logs in, the attacker can hijack the user's session and perform actions on their behalf. Another example is weak password policies, where users are allowed to create weak passwords that are easily guessable or can be brute forced. 3. Cross-site scripting, XSS. This occurs when an attacker injects malicious code into a web page, allowing them to steal user data, redirect users to other sites, or take control of their browser. One example of a cross-site scripting vulnerability is reflected XSS, where an attacker injects malicious code into a website's URL parameters, which are then reflected back to the user's browser. When the user clicks on the link, the malicious code is executed, allowing the attacker to steal sensitive data, such as session cookies or login credentials. Another example is stored XSS, where an attacker injects malicious code into a website's database, which is then displayed to all users who access the site. 4. Broken access control. This occurs when an application's access controls are not properly implemented, allowing attackers to bypass restrictions and access unauthorized resources. One example of a broken access control vulnerability is directory traversal, where an attacker manipulates the path of a web application to gain access to unauthorized files or directories. For instance, an attacker could use directory traversal to access sensitive files such as configuration files or databases that are not intended for public access. 5. Security misconfiguration. This occurs when applications are not properly configured, allowing attackers to exploit vulnerabilities such as default passwords, exposed APIs, or unsecured files. One example of a security misconfiguration vulnerability is leaving default passwords or administrative interfaces exposed. For instance, a web application might come with a default username and password that is not changed by the user, making it easy for an attacker to gain access to the application. Another example is misconfigured servers, where sensitive data is inadvertently exposed to the public internet. 6. Insecure cryptographic storage. This occurs when sensitive data such as passwords or credit card numbers are not properly encrypted, allowing attackers to steal the data. One example of an insecure cryptographic storage vulnerability is storing passwords in plaintext, which can be easily read by an attacker who gains access to the application's database. Another example is using weak encryption algorithms that can be easily cracked, allowing attackers to steal sensitive data such as credit card numbers or other personally identifiable information. 7. Insufficient logging and monitoring. This occurs when an application's logging and monitoring mechanisms are not implemented correctly, making it difficult to detect and respond to security incidents. One example of an insufficient logging and monitoring vulnerability is failing to monitor and detect anomalous behavior. For instance, an attacker might attempt to access sensitive data using an unauthorized account, but if the system is not properly monitored, this activity might go unnoticed. Another example is failing to log security events, which can make it difficult to investigate security incidents. 8. Insecure communications. This occurs when data is transmitted over unsecured channels such as HTTP, allowing attackers to intercept and read the data. One example of an insecure communications vulnerability is transmitting sensitive data over unsecured channels such as HTTP. For instance, an attacker might intercept data being transmitted over an unsecured Wi-Fi network, allowing them to steal sensitive data such as login credentials or credit card numbers. Another example is using weak encryption protocols that can be easily bypassed, allowing attackers to read or modify data in transit. 9. Using components with known vulnerabilities. This occurs when applications use third-party components with known vulnerabilities, allowing attackers to exploit those vulnerabilities. One example of using components with known vulnerabilities is using outdated software or libraries that are no longer supported or have known security vulnerabilities. For instance, an application might use an outdated version of a third-party library that has a known vulnerability, making it easy for an attacker to exploit this vulnerability and gain access to sensitive data. 10. Insufficient authorization. This occurs when applications do not properly enforce authorization policies, allowing attackers to access sensitive resources or perform unauthorized actions. One example of insufficient authorization is failing to properly restrict access to sensitive data or functionality. For instance, an application might allow users to access sensitive data or functionality without proper authorization. Stay tuned for more videos. Please like and subscribe the channels.